So as people are coming to the meeting, I'm just muting you. Please don't take offense. My microphone will pick up everything. So I just want to cut down on feedback. Okay, if anybody can't hear me or is having technical problems, use the chat box. And if I haven't muted you, please mute yourself. I think I'm getting everyone. Hi, everyone. I am watching you come in. I'm just muting you as you come in. So I'm going to be muting everyone's microphone because my microphone picks up everything. So if you have questions or you're having technical difficulties and you just joined the meeting, please use the chat box. It's in the bottom bar of the screen. I think I've got everybody. And I'm just going to give everybody a few minutes to jump on the call. I know sometimes it takes a couple minutes to fully arrive. Okay. Here's someone else. I see Dorian's on. Hi, Dorian. Hi, Celsi. And I see Robin's on. Hi, Robin. And Michelle Wallace. Hello. Maria and Mac. Hi, guys. I've done sessions with a number of you now, so I feel like I know all of you. Hi, Leanne. And hi, Kendra. And Jennifer. Hi. All right, and Frank and Dale. Okay, we've got a lot of people. So we've got 24 people here. I'm going to give it one more minute just to make sure everyone who wants to be here is going to be able to jump on, and then we'll start. So again, if you just joined and you're having technical difficulties, please use the chat box. And I see someone just joined by phone. I'm just giving everybody one more minute to jump on, and then I will start tonight's class. Oh, and I see Heather. Hi, Heather. Great. Okay. Oh, I think this is more than our class last week. Last week we only had 22 people. We've got 24 this week. Okay, so I think everybody who's here is here. So hello, hi everyone. Welcome to tonight's class. I do want to warn you all, I have an insane cat, and my insane cat is laying next to me on the bed right now. He's being very quiet, but he might go insane and psychotic at some point. So if that happens, just know that it's just my cat. That's what you're hearing. So tonight's class is on writing versus editing. And I know last week, for those of you who were here or who had a chance to listen to it, We talked a lot about abstract concepts. We talked about feminine energy versus masculine energy and what that feels like. And we talked about intuitive writing methods versus rational writing methods and what that looks like. Since then, I've done some more sessions with all of you. I've gotten some more emails. We've been talking in the Facebook group, and I've had a lot of questions on the nitty-gritty of the writing process. So what does it look like to move into the intuitive space, and how do we do that? And how do I write there? How do I actually produce a novel or a short story or even a blog post using intuitive writing? And when do I know when I'm finished? When do I know that this thing is done? And then it's time to start polishing it and submitting it and giving it to people. How do I know, and when will I know? So tonight I really want to focus on those nitty-gritty details. I really want to focus on the concrete steps that are part of the intuitive writing process and what that's actually going to look like and what that's going to feel like. And there are a few differences for INFJs and INFPs, actually. And so sorry, I'm hearing someone. I'm just going to mute you out. Okay. There we go. Okay. So I'm going to be focusing on the nitty-gritty, and I'm going to start from the very beginning. What does intuitive writing look like when you get that first seed of a story in your mind, and taking it all the way through writing the story, finishing the story, and transitioning to the editing process? So let's start with the seed of the story. And I guess I'll start with the difference between INFJs and INFPs. And I know some of you really know your type, and some of you are like, well, I might be an INFJ or an INFP. It's not super important that you know that. It's not like it's something you have to run out and nail down. If sometimes you test as an INFJ and sometimes you test as an INFP, that's fine. It's the intuitive piece that's really important. It is good to keep in mind that things tend to go a certain way for INFJs, and they tend to go a certain way for INFPs when you're actually creating the story. If things don't go that way for you, that's fine. There's nothing wrong with you. The information I'm going to be sharing tonight is just the most common stuff I've seen with my clients that I've worked with over the years. It might be different for you, and that's okay. If you are doing something currently that works, you don't need to force yourself into anything I'm going to give you tonight. Everything I'm going to give you tonight is meant to be helpful. So if something resonates with you, cool, take it. If something doesn't resonate with you, leave it. So what I have found, last week we talked about information coming through from an alternate reality or your subconscious, the other side, information coming through, downloads, fragments being received. INFJs tend to receive actual fragments into their mind, images and story pieces. Maybe they see a character. I cited the character standing on the side of the cliff. Like, I see this girl, she's standing on the side of the cliff. What is she doing there? And they tend to start working with that fragment and feeling very compelled to follow it, feeling very curious about, who is this girl? Why is she standing on the side of the cliff? The INFPs get that as well, but INFPs actually tend to find and discover most of the story as they're writing, whereas INFJs, it seems that they find and discover the fragment before they start writing. So what that looks like is an INFJ might be driving or in the shower or taking a walk or listening to music, and they are seeing this fragment unfold in their mind. And it might be a whole scene. It might be part of a scene. It might not even be a scene. It just might be an image. But then they feel like they really want to write that down. They want to write this one fragment that they are holding in their mind down. Now, that fragment might take a few days to coalesce. It might take even a few weeks. INFPs tend to get the idea, and they might even get the fragment too, but INFPs will sit down and sort of channel a lot more of the story in the actual writing session. INFPs tend to do a lot of exploratory writing. So they will discover things that their characters are going to do as they are writing. Now, that happens with INFJs too. It just happens a bit less. So the INFJ will like get a piece, write that little piece. There might be some surprises in there, but then they're done with that little piece and they need to put the work down, back away from it, go back to listening to music, reading books that inspire them, watching movies, taking walks, doing meditation, all that good stuff. Whereas the INFP can really write their way forward a little bit more. Many INFP clients I've talked to tell me that it's like the floodgates tend to open through the act of writing for them. Now, sometimes this also happens to INFJs if they have a particularly strong connection with a character. If the character is really coming through very intensely and is hell-bent on getting their story out, that can also happen for INFJs. So, like I said, it really doesn't matter what you are. I just want to put this out there because you might experience the intuition coming through in those two different ways. So you might get it piecemeal in little fragments, bit by bit. It feels like small little drops in a bucket almost. Or you might sit down for a writing session and boom, it all comes pouring out of you. And you find that you're doing a lot of exploring of the story as you're actually writing. Even if you don't know where it's going, you're sort of exploring your way forward. Either way works. Like I said, I found most INFPs tend to explore their way forward. Most INFJs tend to work with the fragments as they come, but whatever works for you, both work equally well. And you might flip-flop back and forth between the two. So all of that said, let's start at the very beginning of you've got a great story idea. You were at the mall with your mom. You were driving your car to work. You were on the train commuting, whatever. But this image flashed into your head, or a line of poetry, or you heard a character talking to you, or you just saw something, you felt something, you knew something, and it really spoke to you. And you felt like there's a story here. There's something here that I want to explore and I want to build out into a story. So much of the time in the rational writing world, when a writer gets that idea, we immediately grab onto it and we try to decide right out of the gates what it is. We immediately try to decide, well, is this going to be a novel or a short story? That's usually the first question that pops into every writer's mind. Is this a short story or is this a novel? Is there enough here to make a novel? And of course, you just got that first idea. You just got that first seed planted in your mind. You got the image or the character. So almost always it doesn't seem like there's enough there because you have like one fragment. Maybe you have a handful of fragments you're working with, but you normally do not have an entire novel, downloading into your brain. So many writers will kind of jump the gun a little bit and say, well, it's going to be a short story because I can't see myself writing over 30 pages on this. So with intuitive writing, that's number one. You get that idea. It's going to be helpful if you suspend judgment about what it's going to be. You don't know if it's going to be a short story. You don't know if it's going to be a novel. You just don't know. That's okay. You can rest in that not knowingness. The second question that tends to come up, if you've gotten that far, where you're like, okay, I don't know if it's going to be a short story. I don't know if it's going to be a novel. I'm willing to just go with it. I see this character. They're very compelling. I want to find out more. Our rational brain starts saying, well, what genre is this going to be? That's like the follow-up question. Is this going to be a vampire love story? Is this going to be speculative fiction? I know Westerns are big these days. Like, what is this going to be? And we start trying to suss out the details. We start trying to look ahead and say, what am I seeing that I recognize in other people's work? So I'm seeing a little bit of romance. I feel like this character's in love. Maybe it's a romance. Or, it seems like they're in an alien world. It's hard sci-fi. I know it. Once we make that decision of, okay, I think it's this thing, our rational brain starts trying to push it in that direction because we've decided, it's going to be hard sci-fi. That has certain elements. My story needs to have those elements. So again, it's going to be helpful if you can suspend judgment about what genre you are writing in. You actually probably seriously will not know the genre until you're finished with the entire first draft. Now this, again, does not apply to every writer. Some writers are like, no, I know myself. Like one of my clients writes male romance, and she's like, I only write male romance. Every story that comes out of me is male romance. It's been like that for 7 years. I know myself. That's fine. But if you don't have that like track record of years of writing, like I've written 6 novels and they've all been this, if you really just don't know yet, just give yourself permission not to know. You don't know if it's going to be a short story. You don't know if it's going to be a novel. You don't know if it's going to be a Western or a romance or a cozy mystery. You don't know the genre. And you don't know whatever's coming into your brain, if that's a full scene or a full chapter or only a partial chapter. You just don't know. So the rational brain really wants to know. And you're going to be grasping at all of these straws, and you're going to be trying to fit it into all of these boxes, because that will make you feel comfortable, but you just don't know. Okay, so say you've been successful. You're like, okay, I've got this idea. I see this character. I'm really curious. You know, so like I see this man on the subway, and he's riding along with a briefcase, and there's something in his briefcase that could cause disaster. He's very worried about it, and that's all I know. I don't know what's in the briefcase. I don't know who he is or where he's going. I really find this compelling, and I want to follow it. And you've been successful, and I don't know if this is a short story. I don't know if this is a novel, and I don't know what genre. So what you do is you work with that one image. You listen to music. You meditate. You hang out with it. You're not trying to push it. You're just hanging out with that image, just in your day-to-day life, especially as you're driving or doing the dishes or gardening. You're just hanging out with it, and you're seeing what surfaces. And you're not making any judgments about what surfaces. When you see enough that you feel, I really want to start writing this down. I'm getting a pretty clear picture of this guy. I can vividly see the subway. I'm interested to see where this will go. I feel like I have enough to write at least a little bit. That's when you sit down and write. Now, say you're like, okay, I sat down and write, and I wrote like 200 words, and it was literally like there's a guy in the subway with a briefcase, and then nothing else happened. That's okay. You give it a rest. You step away, you give it a rest, and you go back to listening to music, meditation, taking walks, hanging out with the image, hanging out where you left off, just hanging out with it in your mind and seeing what comes to the surface and letting it be as slow as it needs to be. And if you haven't written very much, if you are new to intuitive writing, it is going to tend to be very slow in the beginning. It's going to feel like this dripping faucet where you're like, oh my gosh, nothing is happening. It's been a month and I've got 400 words. And you're going to kind of freak out. Again, rest in the not knowingness. Hang out with the image. Feel into it. Feel what feels most emotionally compelling. Try to get a read on that man. Like, is he sad? Is he angry? Like, what does he feel about what's in his briefcase? Just really work with it. Now, say that you're not hitting that block, but things are starting to come. You know, you write that scene, and then a couple days later, you find another scene is in your mind, and you want to write that one too. And you're moving along at a good clip. Stuff is coming. Stuff is definitely coming. You don't yet know the genre, and you don't yet know the whole story, but you're getting stuff, and you're writing it down. So what usually happens at this point is that people are a little confident, but they're also a lot scared because they're already sort of jumping ahead. Well, how am I going to stitch these pieces together? And it seems like I've written pieces from the ending, but there's a whole lot of middle pieces missing. Or I just wrote 2 big pieces and I know they're linked, but I'm going to have to put a transition in there, and I'm not sure how I'm going to do that. And when it comes down to it, how am I going to write transitions for any of these pieces? Okay, so that fear coming up, again, is going to push you towards trying to control. You're going to be a little freaked out because all these pieces are coming out. They might be coming fast. They might just be coming at a good clip, but they're coming out. And you want to know what it's going to look like. And you want to know how it's all going to fit together. So that's when people make mistake number one at this phase, they start rereading. It really can feel soothing to writers to reread, like, oh, I just want to know where I'm at, or I just kind of want to know what's happening, or I want to get that big picture view. The problem is you've only written 10,000 words or 20,000, or not even that. You've written 5,000 words. You start rereading those pieces, and as you're rereading them, you can't help but move into the left brain space, because you're seeing, gosh, that sentence sounds so clunky, or like, oh, I didn't like that word I used. I did want to find something else. Maybe I should go online and look at thesaurus.com and see if there's another word. Or, oh, I could just polish that. I know that's a spelling error. And all of a sudden, you're editing. It's so easy to go from rereading to editing. That's the number one reason not to reread. The number two reason is every time you reread pieces of your story, every time you reread, even if you're doing it quickly, even if you're just skimming through, the story loses a little bit of its freshness for you. And trust me, when you finish a novel and you are in the editing phases, especially towards the end, you will have reread that novel so many times. You're going to be like, I never want to see it again. The sentences don't even mean anything to me anymore. They're just, I've read them like literally, it feels like 1,000,000 times. So really, in the beginning, don't reread. And I said this last week, if you have to check something, if you're like, I really do need to know what happened, I can't remember, and I want to start the scene there, quickly go back and check it. Other than that, do not reread. This is where trust comes in. You have all of these pieces. You're going to have to stitch them together. You don't know how. You're going to need transitions. You don't know how you're going to work them in. There has to be an ending. You don't know what that's going to look like. This is where the trust comes in. You're writing the pieces. As you write them, you're putting them away in a basket. Now, this can be a physical basket. This sometimes works for my clients. You have a physical basket, you're putting physical pieces of paper in it. It can be a file folder on your desktop. That can be your basket. For me, it's a Word doc. I actually handwrite all of my pieces. I type them up without changing anything, and then I don't look at them. That's it. They're in the Word doc, and then the next time I just add on to it, and I just add on to it. And yes, sometimes it is out of order, and that means I have to go through and do a lot of rearranging when I get to the editing phases, but that's okay. That's what really works. So that's number two. You're not going to reread. So you're not going to decide what your thing is yet. You're not going to decide if it's a novel or a short story or a Western or a romance, and you're not going to go back and reread. You're not going to start rearranging pieces and trying to stitch them together yet or make sense of how everything fits together. You are just writing the pieces. And you're going to keep doing this. You're going to keep doing this. Sometimes this is 6 months. Sometimes this is 4 years. I've had a 4-year first draft. I'm sorry, it happens. It probably won't happen to you, but it does happen. Usually it's about a year or two. I'll be real. Like, most people fall in that 12 months to 24 months range. But this whole time, you're hanging out with the characters. You're getting to know your characters. You're building your relationship with your characters. You're listening to music, you're bringing them into your mind before you go to sleep, when you wake up in the morning, you're connecting with them, you're working with them, and you're writing these pieces and you're putting them away. So this is when people are like, okay, I can do that. I can do all of this, and I can remind myself not to control and not to freak out. But how do I know when I'm done? Like, how do I know when I'm actually finished with a first draft and I am allowed to go back and reread stuff and start stitching it together? So this is, it's not an exact science, because when we're in the writing phase, all of this is the feminine energy phase. This is the pregnancy, childbirth phase. So all I can say is that you will feel like it's pretty much done. You will know that most of it has left your body. You will roughly have a beginning, a middle, and an end. And you will be roughly aware of those 3 parts in your mind. You know, it won't be perfect. You might still have some gaps. You won't be sure of every detail yet. And you might know there's missing stuff. But overall, if someone said, what's your story about? What's your book about? You would be able to say, It's about a man who's on a subway with a briefcase, and he's actually hiding an alien in his briefcase because a UFO crashed into his backyard last night. And it's all about how he makes friends with that alien and sneaks him into, you know, see the president of the United States and what happens after. Like you can give those big pieces. You have that like overall big picture view of your story. So, okay, you've reached that point where you're like, okay, I've been writing for months. I've been trusting. I've been resting and not knowing. I've been collecting these pieces. I've got them all in a basket or a Word doc or somewhat, and I'm pretty sure I'm done. I really feel like most of the story's out of me. I mean, like I said, this will feel like childbirth. Like when a woman has a baby, you feel that leaving your body. The big thing is out of your body. There's still some cleanup afterwards. There's still other stuff to come out, but the baby itself is out. The big thing is out. So that's what you'll be feeling like. So what you're going to do is you're going to take some time away from the manuscript. So say, you know, you wrote the last scene or what you feel is the last scene. It might be something in the middle, but you're like, okay, last night, I'm pretty sure I finished. Last night felt like it was done. I think everything's out of me. You're going to take 2 weeks off. You're just going to walk away. You're really going to want to pull out everything and read it, but you're going to walk away from it. You're going to take 2 weeks off and you're going to go do other things. You're going to read other books. You can work on other writing projects. You can go on vacation. You can do whatever you want, but you're not going to look at your pieces. You're going to just take some time off. When you come back, you are going to look at the pieces. You're going to pull them out. Now, this will depend, your steps here will depend on how the pieces came through for you. If they literally just came through in a complete jumble, they're in no order whatsoever, then you're going to need to do some stitching together. So that's going to be pulling each piece out and saying, is this a beginning piece? Is this a middle piece? Is this an end piece? Okay, I'm going to roughly put the beginning in the beginning. I'm going to roughly put the middle in the middle. And I'm going to roughly put the end in the end. Most of the time, it will be in some sort of order already. The story will have come to you in some sort of order. There might be a couple pieces that you need, or a few pieces that you need to rearrange. But most of the time, for most intuitive writers, it does come in some sort of rough order. So you'll have this whole big document. So you're going to stitch it together, or you might have already just been putting it in one big document. And then you're going to take 2 or 3 days and you're going to read the entire thing. Now, you are not going to read it with your red pen out. You are not going to be reading it and correcting it. You are not going to be reading it and editing it. You are just going to be reading it. And you're not going to be reading it slowly. I say 2 or 3 days because while I don't want you to, push through this like you're a tornado, I want you to be reading this at a good clip. You're not fixating on every other word. You're not obsessing over your vocabulary choices. You're reading the story just as if you were reading a story, and you're not fixing or changing anything. You're getting a big picture view. You're getting an aerial view of the story. So, okay, you've taken 2 or 3 days. You've read the whole thing. It was really hard. You cringed the entire time. Then you're going to put it away again. And you're going to take another few days off. And you're going to think about it. And this will happen naturally. You won't need to push yourself to think about it. You're just going to sort of turn it over in your mind. Did I notice big missing pieces? Did I notice big plot holes? Did I notice big things that didn't make any sense? So the emphasis here is big stuff. If you notice big stuff is wrong, like, there's a beginning and there's an end and there's kind of a middle, but there's really like half the middle missing. And I know that. And I don't know what goes there, but there's a bunch of stuff that's like a big hole there. Or you're like, actually, like, what happens to the character can't happen at all because it just doesn't make sense. There's a huge plot hole and I have to address that, or like the entire story won't make sense. Big stuff. If big stuff is missing, big picture stuff, you're not done writing yet. You are not done with the writing stage. You need to go back into the writing stage, back into the feminine energy space, the intuitive writing space, and you need to work with the missing stuff. So again, you're not pushing it. And this can be very frustrating because you're like, I just spent 24 months writing a first draft. I totally thought I was done. I stitched it all together. I read the whole thing, and now I realize I'm not done. And there are like 2 really big missing gaps that I have to work on. I hate this. I want to just push through it. I want to be done. I'm over it. You're going to have all those feelings. You're definitely going to have the I'm over it feeling a lot. You're going to have to get over the over it feeling. You're not done. It's like in childbirth. I know you want that baby out of you. Like in childbirth, at the end, every woman is over it. You don't want to do it anymore. But you have to keep pushing. You're not done yet. You're almost there. So you're going to go back into the writing space, and you're going to work with those specific pieces. Like, okay, I know I have to, put in this thing about the guy with the briefcase's dad, because if the thing about the dad isn't in there, it doesn't make sense. You're going to work with those pieces until those pieces come through. Again, it might be a while, it might be fast, but you're going to work with it. Okay, so you get the missing pieces and you put them in, and then you're going to reread the whole thing again. Now, say you reread the whole thing and there's nothing big, like you don't notice any big picture issues. You definitely want, better vocabulary choices, and you definitely want to flesh out some characters a little bit more, and you didn't like the way that scene came off, or like the whole thing just feels rough to you, and you're kind of cringing, and you're like, oh, I just want to polish every sentence because I sound like I write like a first grader. That's okay. That's okay. As long as the big stuff is there, you're ready to transition. You are ready to transition from writing to editing. This is the key behind intuitive writing practice. Writing is one thing, editing is another thing. Writing is feminine, editing is masculine. The 2 need to stay apart from each other. The 2 are separate realms. They need to be separated. So now what might happen, because you are going, especially if this is like a first book, you're really going to still have part of you that's trying to race to the finish line. Like, oh, I'm almost done. Now I just need to edit, and then I'm done, and then I can put it out in the world and go on to new things, and that's all I ever wanted in my life. That's fine. That will happen. But what you want to keep in mind is that you're never going to have this experience again. You're never going to have this experience of being in the writing stage of the work, of really deepening the connection with the characters, of really working with them and being in relationship with them. So all of this time you're spending in the writing stage, even if you're frustrated and you just want to be done with it and you want to be on to editing because that feels so much more certain and like you're in so much more control, you're going to have to say goodbye to these characters. Cherish the time you have with them. So that brings me to the transition between writing and editing, because once you're finished with the writing, you're not going to just race right off to the editing. That's not what it's going to be like. You can. It's not going to be the most helpful for you, though. What is going to be the most helpful is if you have a transition between writing and editing. One moment. Let me just, my cat is... Sorry, it's my insane cat. Okay, so the transition between writing and editing. When you finish a novel, when you finish a memoir, this happens to a lot of writers anyway, and they just don't know what's happening. But there's going to be a grieving process. Many, many writers are very sad when they finish a book. This is not something that's really talked about often in the writing world, mainly because we feel like characters are fictional. I should get over it. I should be happy that I've accomplished this project. I'm moving on to something new. That's not the reality of it for intuitive writers. So I just want that to sink in. There's a grieving process. If you feel sad at the end of a book, that is totally normal, and that's actually going to help you transition into editing. When you consciously enter the grieving process, when you consciously know that you're saying goodbye to your characters or you're saying goodbye to the experience of writing your memoir, that ritual and that awareness and that cycle will help close out that loop. So you are closing that era of writing and you are opening a new era of editing. You're closing one chapter and you're opening another chapter. The grieving process will help you transition. This is why, in real life, when people die, we have a grieving process, because you're adapting. You're adapting to one reality that you knew where that person was alive and in your reality, and you're moving into a different reality where that person isn't alive anymore. They're not present in your reality. And the grieving process, there's a reason why in many cultures, the grieving process is 1 year. It usually takes you that long to adapt to a new reality. Now, when you're doing the grieving process with intuitive writing, you don't need to wait a year. I recommend like a month, like 2 weeks to a month. It will also really depend on the work. If you are writing a collection of essays, you might not want to go through the grieving process or need to, because each essay has felt separate and like kind of a short thing. You definitely aren't going to need to do this with blog posts. That's a whole nother ball of wax for intuitive writing. But if it's a novel or a memoir, and especially if it's taken you like 12 months to a year to write that first draft, the grieving process is going to be very helpful. So what you're going to do during the grieving process is you're going to just sit with the saying goodbye to the characters, to the experience. You're going to reflect on what the experience was like for you. What were the hard parts? What were the great parts? What did you learn from it? You can journal about this if you want. You can just go by a lake and sit and throw stones in the water and think about it. It doesn't have to be a big fancy ritual process, but just take some time to go inward and to reflect on all that's happened and your journey and experience with that writing stage. Okay, so you've done all of this. You've gone through the writing stage. You've been in feminine energy for 2 years successfully, ups and downs, but pretty much you did it. You read your whole first draft. There's nothing big missing. You really went through the grieving process, or at least a reflecting process. You took a couple weeks off. You sat with it. You're ready. You are totally, totally ready to move into the editing phase. What do you do now? Well, the editing phase is masculine. So what we're going to be doing is moving into the left side of the brain. We're going to be reading the manuscript again, but this time we are going to have our red pen out. Again, everything I'm saying here, this is just how a lot of my clients do it and a lot of the way I teach. Every writer is going to have their own way that works for them. So take what you will from this. If it doesn't work for you, you don't have to do your editing process like this. I have found, though, it's most helpful if you go from big picture to small details rather than the other way around. A lot of people I know who are writing their first book, because reading that unpolished draft it makes them cringe so much and they feel so uncomfortable. Sometimes they'll actually start going sentence by sentence, polishing every sentence, and then they get to the end and realize that they're actually going to cut 8 chapters that they've spent 3 months polishing sentence by sentence. And that really is a big waste of energy. If you can avoid it, it's great not to waste energy. So I always recommend starting big picture first. So you read the whole thing and you really mark it up with those big picture issues. Another thing I want to say, I just want to pause here and say, it can be really helpful to print it out on physical paper and use a physical pen, a physical red pen. Highlighters sometimes help, a pencil, but really get it into your hands. That helps a lot in seeing where things are missing or what needs to be changed. And sometimes I know people read things out loud, read the sentences out loud. That comes later. But if you can edit with a physical copy, especially when you're really still doing the big picture stuff, that sometimes is helpful. Again, experiment with what works for you. But you're going to be looking at big picture stuff. So you are going to be looking at, like, is there a beginning, a middle, and end? Okay, we've already covered that. Does the ending make sense? Like, did I include everything I wanted to there? Is it, plausible that the character gets from Las Vegas to New York in 30 minutes? Big stuff like that that really jumps out at you, that you're like, oh, that needs to be changed, or like that's got to go, or I definitely wrote 10 paragraphs here and 1 would have done, and I can just pretty much X that stuff out pretty quickly. Then go through and work on that big picture stuff. The next, again, between every revision, I always recommend putting the manuscript away for at least like 3 to 5 days. You don't want to be like revising, jumping right back into like second revision, third revision, because it's all going to start to swim around in your brain and it's all going to like look the same to you. And you're going to forget like, well, did I want to change this or did I not? And you want to keep yourself as clear as possible. You want to give yourself some space between readings. So you fixed all the really big stuff. Now you're going to go back and you're going to be looking for the medium grade stuff, So you're going to be like, well, it actually doesn't really make sense that the character is motivated by that, or, maybe that dialogue does sound kind of stilted, or I do want them to have a longer conversation about that. I want her to say a little bit more about her dad. And again, you'll see that there's definitely a switch in focus. In the writing stage, I really concentrate on what do the characters want to do? Do the characters want to have a conversation? You're the observer. Let them have free reign. Let them be independent. In the editing stage, you are much more going to be bringing the focus back onto you are the writer, you are in control. So what do you think would be the best for that? How do you think that conversation would best be displayed on the page? What do you think about the character's motivations? Do you think that makes sense? Does it not? You're going to be bringing yourself back in. You're directing authoritarian, commanding self, that masculine part of you that decides, that judges, that evaluates, and that criticizes. You're going to have that critical part of you too, where you're like, I hate that word. I don't know why I use that word. I need to go through and strike out every time I use that word. It's horrible. So after you've done the medium grade stuff, then you're going to move on to the small stuff. The small stuff, you're going to take the manuscript sentence by sentence. You're going to go through every sentence and you're going to say, do I like that sentence? Does that sentence work? Is that sentence the best possible sentence it could be? And this is where I get into kind of sticky territory, because I do have writer friends who they write a first draft and then they just hand it off to a professional editor. They're like, oh, I'm not interested in editing at all. Like, I just do the first draft. I give it to my editor. They give it back to me with very specific instructions on, what it's all marked up with the red pen, what I should do, when I should do it. Sorry, my cat is just being crazy. Thank you guys so much for your patience with my neurotic cat. So anyway, that's okay. If you have an editor, if you're like, oh, my editor does all of that and that's what I want, like that really works for me, cool. In most cases, doing a lot of editing yourself will help you become a better writer. It's very tedious. There's a steep learning curve, but it will help you become a better writer. And that doesn't mean I'm suggesting you never use an editor, but I do suggest you do the first like 2, 3, 4 revisions yourself. You really do. You run each of those sentences through your fingers and you say, how does this sound to me? And that's when you're reading it out loud as well. You're reading it out loud and like, do I like that word? What's the flow? What's the rhythm of the sentence? Okay, so you've gotten to that point. So you're like, okay, I've written the whole thing. I've stitched it together. I've done my grieving process. I've put it away many times. I've come back to it many times. I'm ready to, I've done the editing and I'm really ready to move forward with it now. That's when you think about bringing in support for other people. And I do see, let me see, it looks like we have a chat. Oh, Cindy said, such a pretty kitty. Thank you, Cindy. Thank you guys for being so understanding about my cat. Bringing in support of other people. That is part of the editing process too, because most writers are going to want to work with an editor. Working with an editor can be incredibly valuable, but the key is you need to work with the right editor. A lot of times in this part of the journey, intuitive writers can lose a little bit of their power and kind of leak energy because they feel like a professional editor is superior to them in some way. They feel like a professional editor knows more than them. They're the expert, they're the authority. So they kind of go around to editors like, oh, please take me on. Like, Like, I really hope you like me, and I really hope you approve of my writing. That's not how the power balance should be in a relationship with an editor. It should definitely be an equal exchange. You should feel like you love and trust your editor. You are in a safe space when you're with them. You trust their taste in books. They like the kind of stuff you write. They're on your wavelength. They're not going to try to force you to be something that you're not. And they're not going to try to sort of bully you into changes that you don't want to make. That can be really, really hard for intuitive writers because we are so accommodating and we hate conflict. We avoid conflict at all costs. So a lot of times we'll get into a relationship with an editor and we just give all our power away. We're like, well, I don't know, they know what's best. And then we change the story and we're like, I don't really feel right about that, but I guess they know best. You really, really want to take your time looking for a great editor, and you want it to be like a 100% personality match. Okay, so say you've got your great editor, you know, you've worked with them, but you also want to bring in beta readers. You want more than one person's feedback. So how do we find good beta readers? A lot of times, especially if the writer is just starting out, this is their first book, they immediately think of their friends and family. And this will happen a lot when you're writing a book. You'll start sort of telling people that you're writing a book. You'll mention it here and there to people, you know, you think are safe. And you're like, oh, I'm writing a book and I feel kind of weird about it, but I'm going to put it out there. And most people say, oh my gosh, you're writing a book? I'd love to read it. Let me know when you're done. I'd love to read it. And the writer is like, oh, great. Sally wants to read my book. I'm going to put Sally's name on a little list in my head. I'll just kind of keep that on file. So then they get to that point where they're looking for beta readers and they pull out this little Rolodex and they're like, oh, Sally said she wanted to read it. Uncle Bob said he wanted to read it. And Margaret from my work, she wants to read it. Okay, cool. I have like 10 people. And they give the manuscript to these 10 people. Most of the time, 9 of the 10 people, it's just crickets. The writer hears nothing. And then the 10th person will like sort of interact at the beginning and then be like, oh yeah, I started it. I'll get back to you next weekend. And then they lose them too. So it's been 2 weeks. It's been 3 weeks. It's been a month. The writer is going crazy. The writer's like biting their nails. Oh my God, I gave it to all these people. I haven't heard anything. It must be horrible. Everyone's read it and they've all judged it as horrible and they don't know how to tell me. So I'm a complete failure as a writer. No, what happened is that you chose civilians as beta readers. And by civilians, I mean non-writers. Non-writers don't understand. They don't understand a lot of things about the writer's life, but they really kind of don't understand being a beta reader. Every now and again, if it's like your spouse or a best friend, they get it because they know you and they know how important this is and they know what a big deal it is. Sally, you know, from your work or your Uncle Bob, they don't get it at all. Usually what happened, you emailed them, they don't read very much anyway, or they started to read it, but it was in a Word doc and it just felt weird to them to sit at their computer and read. So they put it down and they didn't think about it anymore. If someone does finish it and they get back to you, they just say, oh, it was nice. I liked it. And you're like, that's it? I spent 3 years of my life on this. It's 95,000 words. It was nice and you liked it like anything else? And they're like, no, not that I can think of. Or somebody will say, oh, I just didn't like the ending, but I can't really say why. So they either give you no feedback or they give you really unhelpful feedback that drives you even more insane because then you're like, well, Uncle Bob didn't like the ending, but what's wrong with the ending? I thought it was great. And then you're sort of picking apart the ending. This can all be avoided if you either pick beta readers who are fellow writers that you know from like a writers community, you know them relatively well, maybe it's an online writers community. The two of you have like exchanged manuscripts before, or you know, you're reasonably sure they know what kind of stuff you write, they actually are interested in it. Or you hire a professional beta reader. This is kind of a new thing in recent years, but yes, there are professional beta readers. It can be really helpful to hire a professional beta reader. Beta readers tend to be a lot cheaper than editors. Or there's even professional beta readers who will do a manuscript exchange with you and do it for free. So you could, you know, maybe get like 3 like people who are like, oh, I beta read all the time. Like that's something I do, but I'm willing to do some sort of barter with you instead of, you know, payment. That can work out really well. When you use beta readers who are writers and who are professional beta readers, they will get back to you in a timely manner. They will let you know if there's been a delay in them starting to read your work. They will give you very specific feedback where they're like, I don't think the ending worked and this is why. You know, I don't think that this structure is working and this is why. This is how I would change it, or I would make a suggested change. You know, they'll function much more like an editor. So that's what you want to keep in mind when you're starting to show people. You want to be very careful about who you're showing it to. And just to jump back a bit, when you're still in the writing phase, when you're gathering all these pieces are coming through you, you're going to have good writing days and bad writing days. On the good writing days, you're going to be very tempted to show your work to other people. You're going to be like, I just wrote like that scene. It was genius. I just want to show my friend, or I just want to send it. You know, you're going to want to talk about it, tell people about it, and show them, you know, maybe all of it or pieces of it. I really, really, really strongly urge that writers do not do this. I strongly urge that writers keep it very close when you're in the writing stage. Again, I think of it as, you know, you're pregnant with a baby, or you just had the baby. The baby's 2 days old. You don't want to hand the baby around to like 50 different family members, because the baby's 2 days old. It's fragile. You know, it's this tiny, tiny thing, and it's still sort of getting its foothold in life. So keep that in mind. That's very, very important. Let's see, I have a message from Leanne. Oh, Leanne, I'll get to your question in 1 minute, because I'm actually going to open up for questions. This was a lot of stuff. So I'll open up for questions now. And then if you guys want a little bit more to marinate for questions, I have some other stuff to give you. But Leanne says, does a particular type of editor tend to work better with an intuitive writer? The most valuable feedback I've gotten has been at a very high level. Structural editing, I guess. I just can't seem to connect with a line editor. This is a great question. I think I've mentioned before, I have certain people I use for my clients. I used to do editing years ago, and I don't do it anymore. But I have a woman who is an INFJ herself, and she is a wonderful editor. And I find she works very well with the INFJ and the INFP people I give her, because she's so gentle. And she's so kind. She's very empathetic about the work. She gets just as attached to the characters as the writer does. And one of the big complaints I've actually found with intuitive writers, when they work with beta readers or editors who don't like their characters, that can be very hard. And I've actually found this way more with beta readers, because a good professional editor will be able to stay pretty neutral about the characters. But a lot of beta readers, if they're not professional or they haven't done it for very long, sometimes the writer will have a character that the beta reader just doesn't like. It's triggering to the beta reader in some way. And the beta reader will say like, well, I just thought he was a jerk. I think you should change that. And then that can send the INFJ or INFP writer into a spiral of self-doubt. Like, well, so-and-so thought my character was a jerk, and maybe he is a chauvinist pig, but I really think that's how he is, and that's important to the story. You always have to stay true to your characters. There's a difference between something, and like Leanne said, you know, structural editing. There's a difference between something not working and somebody not liking something. Something not working is something that a lot of people, your editor will see it, your beta readers will see it. Once it's pointed out to you, you'll usually see it. You'll be like, oh yeah, that actually doesn't work. Somebody not liking something is a different story. And when they give you that feedback, it will be much more emotional. And they will say things like, well, I just thought he was a jerk. Or I didn't like the way she slept around. You know, that seemed really gross to me. Like, they'll have these emotional judgments about it. Because they will be feeling triggered in some way. And this can also happen with editors. I've had clients come to me in tears because they got some editor, and the editor was like, well, this just didn't make any sense, and I didn't like the way that the main character did this, and he's stupid. I actually, one of my clients, their editor told them that they just felt their main character was stupid, just was not very intelligent. And that wrecked my client. I mean, for weeks, you know, he was like, I love this main character. I don't feel like he's stupid at all. And that was a really low blow, you know, so it took him some recovery time to come back from that. Does anybody else have any questions right now? And it could be about editing. It could be about writing. It could be about anything. Feel free to throw it out. I'm not seeing anything. So I'm going to go on to some of the challenges that you are going to find in writing and in editing. To be honest, once you're in the editing phase, I don't want to say you're home free, but you've gotten through a lot of the really hard stuff. The editing stages are tedious. The editing stages don't tend to be that emotionally challenging. Sometimes, yeah, you will get that bad beta reader, you'll get that bad editor, they hate your character, you go into emotional spiral. That happens. But most of the time, the editing stage is just going to feel like a big hill to climb. You're just going to be like revising, putting it away, revising, putting it away, rereading, getting tired of rereading. It's going to feel like this kind of endless cycle of, you know, wash and rinse, repeat. But it's not going to be something you have to like really work with the emotional side of things. It's just going to be work. And honestly, you're going to feel probably in control and soothed by that, because if you're an INFJ, you're a perfectionist. And INFPs even can do pretty well with editing. It feels predictable. It feels like, okay, I'm just going, you know, line by line. When you're in the writing stage, the biggest challenge is that you're just going to feel like it's so messy. It's going to be very hard for you, especially as a highly sensitive person, to deal with that mess. Oh, sorry, some questions came through. So from Robin, what if you get visions of more than one story? This is going to come back to experimenting with what works for you. As a rule, and again, there's always an exception to this, but INFPs tend to do very well working on different projects at the same time. And working in circles, like going over here, working on this one day, then going over here, working on this another day. INFJs tend to do better working on one thing. However, you might be an INFJ and working on 2 novels at once or 3 novels at once. If you can do it and it works for you, that's fine. Work with the fragments as they come through. Hang out with the different characters as they're coming through. Let's see. Kendra says, when you say string it together before reading for the first time, does that mean put all the pieces into a linear format? How much effort should be put into this part? So again, okay, so first of all, this is going to depend on what kind of order the pieces came through in the first place. If they just all totally randomly came through, like you literally have a beginning and then an end and then a middle and then an end and then a middle and then like they're just all over the place, you are going to have to spend some time stitching that together. It's unavoidable because they all came through in a jumbled mess. You don't need to be like obsessively labeling them and like making sure that they are in the exact order they're going to be in at the very end. You can really be like, okay, these are all the beginning pieces, all the middle pieces, all the end pieces. So you're going to have to spend some time because it's a jumbled mess. But again, you're not going to be like obsessively spending 6 months on this. You should be able to do it in 2 to 3 weeks, realistically. If they came through in somewhat of a linear manner, but you just need to rearrange a few things, it should take like about a week. If you're one of the lucky ones and they came through like in an exact linear manner, like that's great. You won't have to spend that much time at all. Let's see. Cindy says, linking to Robin, what if you are doing a series or a series of series? How do you know when a particular story is done when they're all linked in some way? Cindy, this is a really good question. And this is actually where having a writing coach can really, really be helpful. Because I have worked with a lot of people when they are writing their first trilogy, because some people write multiple trilogies. The first one, they have no idea. Like they think they're writing one book and then they're like, oh, wait, I'm actually writing 3 books. Or they think they're writing one book and they're like, oh, wait, I'm kind of smashing the sequel into the first book. So that's when it can be very, very helpful to have someone like a trusted writing coach. I work with my clients long term. I have clients I've worked with for 5 and 6 years. So I know all their work. I've read all their stuff. I see stuff when it's very, very rough. I see things when it's in the very beginning stages, and I can really like tease that out with them. Like, oh, is this a trilogy? Is this a sequel? What's going on here? If you don't have a writing coach, a lot of the time you're just going to have to sort of stumble through the dark with it for a bit until you get your footing. If you're like writing and writing and writing, if you're like, I've written 600 pages, I'm at like 180,000 words, and I don't know if it's one book or two. It's two. Like, it's so much. If you go over 90,000 words and you still feel like you have a lot of the story to tell, that's a good indicator that you're looking at a sequel or you're looking at a trilogy. Andrew Parker says, once you leave the intuitive writing space and truly enter the editing stage, how do you define the editing cycles? This is a really good question. As you get more experience with the writing process, as you write more books, you will get to know this for yourself. You'll know how you work best in the editing process. Your first book, it's going to be a lot of trial and error. For people who are writing their first book, this happens like universally across the board. All of my clients are like, I'm done. I'm totally done. It's as polished as it's ever going to get. And I'm like, you're not done. And they're like, no, I'm done. I know I'm done. And I'm like, no, you're not done. I know you're not done. And they're not done. And then they'll do it again. They'll do another revision. Okay, this time I'm really done. And I'm like, oh, you're not done yet. Because you want to be done so badly. And because this is the only version of this book that you've ever seen. You haven't gotten to the end yet. So it can be really helpful to have a writing coach, or to have be part of a writing group that's not necessarily a critique group, but maybe somewhere where you can find people and be like, hey, can you beta read? Like, you don't have to hire a professional beta reader, but someone you can show it to and say, like, what do you think? Am I done? Like, that's when you can start to sort of source outside feedback and work with that. I just want people to be really careful with who they give the manuscript to and how they receive that feedback. Okay, let's see. Louis says, about the early writing process, what I find is that the fragments I receive fit together in unexpected ways, with earlier fragments suddenly making more sense when combined with later ones. The issue I have is that I don't know what or how much to write for each received fragment. The temptation is to wait until I have the entire picture before starting. Well, you could wait until you have the entire picture before starting. You really could. And sometimes that happens. Sometimes a writer will sort of get a story germinating in them and they'll hold on to it. But because life will get in the way, like I've had clients who are like, yeah, and then I had 2 kids, like I had 2 kids and then my husband lost his job and I started a new job and then we moved to France and like a bunch of stuff happened and it was like 5 years went by and I held on to this story idea the entire time. A lot of times in that instance, the writer then will be able to sit down and that first draft will flow out in like 6 to 8 months. And that actually happened to me. My last novel took me 6 months to write. And it was because I had the idea in like 2014, but then I got pregnant. I had my son. There were a bunch of changes at my work. Like my dad died. I went through a bunch of stuff and I just couldn't start it. Like I just couldn't. So I finally started it in the middle of 2018. And by that time it had been like sitting in me for years, and I hadn't even consciously been like, oh, let me see if I can get more of it. It just sort of grew on its own. So you can definitely do that, Louis, but there will probably be a much longer germination time where you're not writing on the story. You're just sort of like sitting and like letting it all come in. That's okay. That wasn't really that pleasant for me, having that 4 years where I couldn't really write and I just had other life responsibilities and, the story kept unfolding in my head anyway. I find if you feel like you have a complete scene, even if it's a short scene, even if it's a scene that doesn't seem to go anywhere, but like you have like 2 people at a restaurant on a date and then they walk home and they part ways and you can see all of that. You can start writing. You can write that down. When you have a completed picture of anything, you can start writing, and then you can wait for the other stuff to come. And like I said, it might be months before the rest of it shows up, and then you're like, oh, now finally it's the morning after the date, and 6 months later in my time. But yeah, you can, again, work with whatever works for you. The thing about intuitive writing, it's going to be a lot like figuring out what nourishment works for you, what nutrition. And I know I referenced this in last week's class, but there are tons and tons and tons of people out there that will say, this is the diet. This is the diet you should be on. It works for everybody. Humans are wired to eat this way. And then it doesn't work for you. And every human body is unique. So most people find, they're like, this works for me. Like, I can't have carbs, you know, or I can't have meat. I don't feel good when I eat meat. Or I can't have dairy, you know, or I can't have anything, you know, I can have like 3 things that don't affect me. That's the way it is. Every human's unique. Your artistic process is going to be the same way. So as you keep writing and as you keep finishing things and working with intuitive writing, you're going to be like, okay, like I actually need to sit for a year or 2 and let it all come to me. Or I can start working with fragments right away, you know, or I actually only do 2 big revisions and then I am comfortable passing it off to an editor. Or you might be like, I need to do 12 revisions and I want every sentence perfect before I let anyone even look at it, you know. It's going to come down to you. And that's going to be a lot of trial and error and experimentation and just like trying stuff, seeing how you feel. Trying stuff, seeing if it works. If something doesn't work, stop doing it. Let's see. So Frank says, I've been told by my instructors that my stories have so much emotion and movement. It is not a short story, but a novel. So what might be happening, Frank? You might be getting a fragment of a novel and then like using it to write a short story. And that fragment actually wants to expand. This also, I should bring this up, this happens a lot for writers who have not yet written a book or who have not yet finished a novel. There's a common bit of writer thinking out there that you should always start with short stories. And I know some of the greats say that, like I think Ray Bradbury said that, you know, and a couple of other people said that. But the thing is, like, Ray Bradbury writes great short stories. Like, he wrote a bunch of great short stories. That was definitely something that really worked for him. That was a talent he had of writing great short stories. Not every writer is a short story writer. I have written very few short stories. I've written some. I've gotten into some short stories. I've gotten like the inspiration and the fragments came through and I did it. But as a rule, short stories are not where my energy tends to flow to. I much more tend to flow into novels. So, you know, Frank, you have to do what works for you. You might just be working with short stories that are packed full of emotion. You know, that it really depends on what works for you. Maria says, would you speak a bit about the relational structure of research and writing in the writing process? For example, are they done concurrently, separately? I ask because the novel I am writing requires a fair amount of research. This is a really good one. Okay, here's the thing about research. Research is really, really valuable, especially for intuitive people. Intuitive people tend to do this thing where we soak things up, like we're like a big sponge. We soak up a place. We soak up a person we're in love with. We soak up a time in our lives. We soak up learning and knowledge. So I just want you to picture yourself. You're like this big sponge. And all these books, and you're reading all these articles, and you're doing all this research, and you're soaking it up. A lot of times when we've soaked up enough, the answer to what we're looking for or the pattern we're trying to see suddenly will just pop in our mind. It kind of just happens all at once. You know, we're like, oh, I see it. I got the epiphany. I got the realization. So that soaking up is really important for us to do, especially if we are writing like a historical fiction novel. The novel that I wrote in 6 months, the main character was a magician with a pretty damaged background in Christianity. And I just soaked up a bunch about Christianity. I didn't know anything really about it. My family was not religious, so I just read everything. And I really, really soaked that in, and it helped the novel a lot. It helped the fragments to come through because I felt so much closer to him. He had been raised Pentecostal, and I really got into that. And I really felt that that deepened my emotional connection with him, knowing what he had gone through. So it can be very helpful in that way to do it concurrently. Yes, like be researching and be reading these books on the topic at hand, and also writing at the same time, and letting that sort of like swirl together and influence each other and all come together in this like magic stew. That's awesome. What can happen though? This is the thing you have to be on the lookout for. A lot of times when that fear comes up about like, well, I don't know where the story's going, I can't see the ending, things feel really uncertain, things feel really messy, which I'll get back to. There is this tendency of like, I'll go do more research. I'll just put this on hold and I'll go do more research. And then we kind of go down a research rabbit hole. And then it's like, well, I can't start until I've done more research. And there's always another book to be read. And I know this got brought up in last week's class about, you know, if you want or feel compelled to write in a character's voice who's very different from you, you know, like you're a white person, you want to write as a Black person, or, you know, you're a gay person, you want to write as a straight person, like whatever it is, there's a really heavy reluctance of like, oh, I don't even know if I should start this. So like, let me just research the hell out of it. And maybe if I research it enough, it will be okay. And it doesn't necessarily come down to research. It's more about giving yourself permission to just start. A lot of the time, the research you're missing, you can just put in brackets in the manuscript a note like, hey, find out more about this later, or fill this in after doing research. Just a note to yourself that you want to do a little bit more research and fact check, that kind of stuff. Let's see. Oh, Kim says, thank you for describing the fragment and download process for INFJs versus INFPs. As an INFP, I'm recognizing that it is so important to go to the page to start writing and discover as I write. I should put this in all caps. I love it. That's great, Kim. This information is motivating. Thank you. Yeah, you know, actually, I didn't really realize this until very recently, because I have a very good writer friend who writes young adult novels, and she's an INFP, and we were on the phone this summer, and she told me, I'm so glad you're talking about channeling in writing. She said, I think that's what I do. And I never really was able to acknowledge that. I felt kind of weird using that word channeling. I think it's because INFJs, our primary function is introverted intuition. So we really go inward to put together pieces. We sort of like go out and gather little nuts like squirrels, and then like go in it within and bury the nuts, you know? And it's a very introspective thing. We really like look within to see what we're feeling. And we use our feeling to decide how we feel about a pattern and if that feels right to us. INFPs, their second function, so their auxiliary function, is extroverted intuition. Extroverted intuition really works with stuff coming from the outside, you know, and I actually just worked with an INFP client yesterday, and I told him, and this is true of a lot of INFPs, I said, it's like you have a supercharged antenna. Everybody has an antenna, every human being on earth. Most people in the mainstream population, their antenna gets like 3 to 5 radio stations, and they're all the local stations. INFPs get like satellite radio. Like you guys get like 500 stations, and some of them are from Russia, and some of them are from India, and some of them are from Mars. Like you get all sorts of stuff, and it's coming in all the time, which is why it can be so overwhelming to be an INFP. But I think when you're writing, you have that talent for channeling, much more than INFJs do, honestly. Like you really can channel things as you write, and that's a really powerful ability with INFP. Let's see. Dale says, when writing a scene, I often reach a point that I know I want something, but am not clear. I sometimes just enter, fill in cool stuff here and move on. For instance, I suddenly know I want a bright blue flower, but I also know I want to have the flower type for specific description. So I just put bright blue flower in the manuscript. I was actually typing this up as a question, like, is this a good strategy to not get hung up on a specific piece? Oh, yes. And you know what? I want to emphasize it again, Dale. And I know that I already covered it, but I really want to emphasize it to you guys. Put things in brackets. If you're writing and you get stuck, put things in brackets. It doesn't have to just be research stuff. It can be like you can't find the right word. It can be like you can't describe the right facial expression. If you're sitting there with your pen like hovering over the page for over 25 seconds, whatever it is, put it in brackets and move on. Just keep going because you're getting stuck. Let's see. Andrew says, to Maria's question on research during the writing process, I have done this in question myself when I thought too much of what I read led into my story. This created a conflict for me. That's a great, I'm really glad you brought that up, Andrew, because that happens to writers so much. So I think I've talked about this before, that we are taking in the world as nourishment, and we tend to get very curious and very passionate about things. When I was writing my magician's story, his father was a Vietnam War vet, and I watched Ken Burns' Vietnam documentary, like the whole thing. It's something like 15 hours or something. I don't know, but it's long, and I watched the whole thing, and I was like into it, you know. And it really, really started to color my view of my character's dad. And as I was writing dialogue, like things that the real life soldier said in that documentary came through, you know, out of the dad's mouth. And part of me was like, oh, I can't put that in there. Like, I got that from a Ken Burns documentary. I can't put like these 2 lines of dialogue that this real life soldier said. And then, you know, I did it anyway, and I put it away. And months later, I was like, it's fine. It's really, really fine. It's going to be an intermingling. Like, you don't have to have your work in this sterile little bubble. And then the stuff that influences you is like all the way over here, and it's totally divided. It's all going to mix up in your soul, and it's going to sort of transform itself. You know, you're going to be pouring, and that's why I said with Maria's question, like, a magic stew, because you're going to be pouring all this stuff in, and it's okay if it influences you. And you know what, in the editing stages, if something was like too much of an influence, we were like, wow, actually, like, I just rewrote Edgar Allan Poe's story, The Telltale Heart, and I didn't even realize it, but it's the same thing, you know. Then you can deal with it then. Like, then you can say, like, okay, I might need to go back and, like, write a new story because I can see now that this was too much of an influence. But as you're writing it, if it's really speaking to you, if it's really calling to you, use it. Use all of it. Yeah, you are, you know, a lot of times with songs, writers really want to put exact song lyrics into a book. I always say you can't do that. That's a legal issue. But really, if a song is calling to you and you're just playing it over and over, and there's just something that's just so haunting, like, go deep into it. You know, you can use that imagery. You can use that same symbolism. You can use the emotion, whatever it is that's influencing you. You are changing it just by it running through the filter of you. Jennifer says, oh, thank you. Yeah, and if I miss a question, please repeat it because the chat just goes by. Repeating question, you missed it. And to take that research question a step further, when your characters are based on real life people in history, what's the balance between historical accounts and receiving fragments directly from them? So during the writing stage, I would say as long as you can, suspend judgment about what you're writing. Download the fragments you can download. Just go with it. Just go with it. When you have finished it and you're rereading it, then decide what it is. If you're like, okay, this is obviously fiction. It's based on a historical figure, but I obviously took it in my own direction. Cool. If you're like, well, actually, this is reading like it's supposed to be an autobiography, and I used so much facts and so much research. I feel like I just need to actually like edit out some of the places I got a little crazy, and this could be a historical autobiography. Go with that. Most of the time, if you are in a heavy, intense period of downloading fragments, you're probably writing fiction, and you don't need to worry about it. If you set out to write like an autobiography, it's going to feel like a drier process. You can still use intuitive writing, but it's going to be much more of a drier, linear thing. Kendra says, I have trouble balancing the high of writing with real life. How do I calm down from writing? This is a good one, Kendra. The answer is there is no easy answer to this. This is something that writers really struggle with. And I find, you know, I've been talking with a number of clients this week about the instability of creative energy. Creative energy is by its very nature unstable energy. It has to be. Creative energy has not yet taken form. It is the energy of something trying to take form in the world. So if an environment is very rigid, very linear, very structured, very authoritarian, everybody knows what's going to happen, there's not a lot of room for creative energy to work in that, because creative energy needs space and possibility. So if an environment's very free and very open and kind of anything goes, and all new possibilities can be considered, creative energy is going to love that. So when artists work and when writers work and we're in that intuitive space, we're in that writing space, we are dancing with creative energy and we're dancing with instability. This can be really challenging and really hard for some people, because a lot of times when you're in an intense writing period, you will feel manic. You will definitely feel manic and you will question that, especially because in our society, there's such an emphasis on what is normal behavior, what is not normal behavior, what is mental illness, what are the signs, what do you need to look out for? There's a lot of fear around that. Now, I'm not saying that it's not helpful sometimes to be aware of, you know, mental illness in your family or what the signs are, or if you feel like you are suffering from a mental illness. All that stuff can be somewhat helpful, but there's such a culture of fear around it, of like, this is bad. If you feel manic, this is bad. If you feel depressed, this is bad. If you feel manic and then depressed, this is definitely bad. Feeling manic and feeling high during the writing stage is quite normal. Feeling depressed and feeling low when a project has come to an end is quite normal. Writers and artists tend to have an emotional pendulum that swings very wide. So we go from manic to depressed. We go from intense sorrow to intense euphoria. And that can happen when we're just walking down the street in the middle of a rainy night alone, you know, and we're just like soaking in the sounds and the smells, and these memories are coming up. Like, we're very intense people. So a lot of times it's not going to be easy when you're in an intense writing period. The people around you are going to get weird or worried or have reactions around it. Every time I'm in an intense writing period, my marriage gets very difficult because my husband really hates it. He's like, I know this is your passion. I know that you love it, but I feel like you're not here. And he's like, I feel like you're not here like all of the time. Like, I'm talking to someone who's like kind of half present and distracted and not really listening to me. So that's hard. And my son will pick up on it too. My son's only 4. But when I'm in an intense writing period, he gets very needy. Like, look at me, look at me, look at me, mom, because he can tell I'm not fully here. So it's hard. I come out of those periods and then I'm in an editing period and I'm here and I'm grounded. I'm just cranky. And that's a whole nother set of challenges. But there is no magic bullet that you're like, okay, I did my writing work for the day. Things are really intense right now. I feel totally high and in love with the characters and I never want to come down. But I'm just going to shift into down gear right now because it's 5 o'clock and it's the end of the workday for me. It doesn't really happen that way. So the best thing you can do is to really be aware of your creative cycles and how they work. Again, it's going to be like nutrition. It's going to be like a menstrual cycle sometimes. Like, oh, this is the part of the cycle where I'm really low. This is the part of the cycle where I'm really high. This is the part of the cycle where not much is happening. As a writer and artist, that's going to just happen for you. There's going to be an ebb and a flow. It's going to be like high tide and low tide, and all of it's normal, even if it's challenging. Andrew G says, so don't worry so much about spelling errors when in the manic writing process. Yes. Yeah, don't worry about spelling errors at all. And something I encourage all writers to try, and it might not work for you, but handwriting. Handwriting a first draft can be an entirely different experience than typing. And part of that is because when you're typing, especially if you spend a lot of time on the computer and you're a fast typer, it's very easy to go back and start changing things as you're typing. Like, you type a sentence but your brain is still back here like, oh, I really didn't like that word. So you back up and you delete that word and put another one in, and then you type on, oh, but I really didn't like the end of that sentence. So it's like this sort of push-pull, like you're typing forward, but then you're going back and self-editing, but then you're typing forward because it's so easy to do, especially if you have a mouse too. You can just like click all over the place. I'm like, oh, I want to fix that. And before you know it, you're just editing. Like you're just editing as you go. When you handwrite, it is not at all as easy to back up. It can be a lot more frustrating because your brain is moving faster than your hand can move. And you can actually experience a lot of pain in your hand. This always happens to me when I'm in like a manic writing frenzy. My hand, I feel like I have like severe arthritis. Like I'll get done and my hand's just like this claw, and I actually have to like unfold it. And it's all red and angry looking, and I'm like, I'm gonna lose my hand. But handwriting, it really brings a connection forward that I found is much harder to get with typing. Writers and artists, writers are artists, first of all, and artists are tied to their hands. Artists are really about shaping and forming and creating things in this world, whether that be bread dough, or plants out of soil, or they're knitting something, or they're putting together a machine, or they're sculpting a beautiful statue, or they're writing words. Artists are tied to their hands. Their hands are their creating tools. So when you get that pen or that pencil in your hand and you feel that physical sensation of connecting with the paper, it can be really helpful to bring those intuitive fragments through. It can also be helpful because you can't write as fast as you can type for the most part. So it does make you slow down a little bit, and you won't have that tendency to go back and self-edit so much. Let's see. And then Kim says, self-care. Okay, I'm not seeing any other questions at the moment. So I'm just going to add a couple other pieces that I really want everyone to keep in mind when I talked about the hardest part of being in the writing process. For highly sensitive people, it's definitely the mess. It's messy. Being in the middle of writing a first draft, the intuitive way, feels a lot like having your kitchen remodeled. Like, you're still kind of using the kitchen, like you're keeping food in the refrigerator, you're trying to cook simple things on the stove, but the tile is like all ripped out around the counters. The cupboards don't have doors on them, or the contractor was there yesterday and left all his tools on the floor. And so what happens with highly sensitive people, because we pick up on stimulus so easily, we pick up on things in our environment so easily, that when things are messy around us, it can stress us out. It really can. And we tend to feel like our control mechanisms are just sort of like swirling down the drain. So it can really feel like living in a house that's being remodeled, where part of you is always like uncomfortable and like, oh, I hate this. I just want to be done so I can close the loop. INFJs in particular tend to be like this. INFJs really love closing the loop. If there are too many loops open, an INFJ can start to get stressed. And I always joke with Jazz, who's in this class, because he's an INFP. So I read somewhere about, INFPs and INFJs handle email differently. And we found this is the way for us. INFPs tend to have an inbox just full of thousands of emails. And they're just all there, and INFJs use their email inbox as a to-do list and tend to have like 10 and under emails because they deal with each thing as it comes in, or they file it away, or they label it, but it goes somewhere. So INFJs really like to do that because to have this inbox with like thousands of emails just makes them crazy. So we really, really like to close the loop. And when we're in the mess of a first draft, it's going to be an open loop for a while. That's going to drive us nuts. The solution is to be in acceptance of that. And that's hard. And one more question from Leanne. My writing process tends to be iterative, like doing a pencil sketch before painting a watercolor. All too often, important details of the story don't emerge until I reread. Yes, that will happen. And that's why I emphasize reading the whole first draft at once. And you can take notes, but I like not even pausing to take notes, because the faster you read it, if you do it over a 2 or 3 day period, stuff will really jump out at you, like really obviously, where you're like, oh, that theme is showing up and I never expected that, or like, I really want to enhance this. But that's why you do the rereading, is to get that aerial view. Let's see. Frank says, should the space where we write be sterile of distractions, like books on writing and pictures? You know what? That's up to you, Frank. This is something else I'd like to bring up, and everyone is going to have their own reaction to it. I know if you go online and you look at writing culture, there's a lot of stuff around the ritual of writing. So you'll see an article like how 10 famous writers structured their writing day, you know, or what Stephen King's workspace looks like, you know, how Agatha Christie, you know, started off her morning before she sat down to write, you know, and that's very attractive, I think, to people, because it's like, well, if I set things up in the perfect way, if I have like the perfect desk or, you know, the perfect morning routine, then this is going to be easier. You know, that's what's missing. And I also think most writers are not writing full time as they're living. They have day jobs or they're parents, but they have like large parts of their life that do not involve writing and that tend to be frustrating, because it's like, I have to work in an office and that sucks. Or like, I have 2 kids under the age of 3 and that kind of sucks, you know, like there's hard stuff. So I think we idealize this writing life of like, well, wouldn't it be so wonderful if I had my own little writing cottage and no one bothered me and I just woke up every day and I walked through the meadow to the cottage and I sat down and had a cup of tea and then wrote to my heart's content. Like, yeah, but you know what happens? A lot of times when people get that writing cottage, they get out there and then because they're INFPs and they're INFJs, and we really need people, as much as we get overwhelmed by people, we need people. We write for like an hour and then we're done and we're like, okay, I need something to do. Like now I'm bored and I feel isolated in this little cottage. And I need something more to do. So the thing about writing is you don't have to have the perfect space. You don't even have to have a good space, honestly. When I first started writing, it was so hard for me to write that I joined a writing program. We met once a week at a mansion. It was very fancy, and we did a silent hour of writing. I needed that. I needed that push and that pressure of like other people waiting for me to join the meeting. Like I felt like when we were at the meeting, you know, we were at a circular table. Other people could see if I was writing or not. I needed that pressure. That really worked. As the years went on, I found it was easier and easier to just write wherever I could. And especially since I've had my son, and I worked full time, I had my coaching business, you know, and I had this toddler. Now I can just write anywhere. Like my son can be running in and out of the room, like throwing spaghetti on me, and like the cat's going crazy and my husband's talking to me. And I can like pay attention to all that. And then they leave and I have literally 2 minutes and I'm like, let me get that little fragment. Let me get part of the fragment. Okay. And then they'll come back in and interrupt me. And I'm like, okay, interruption. And I can do that now. It took a lot of mental work though. It took a lot of pushing myself to experiment and see that I don't have to have the perfect writing space. And honestly, I don't even have to have that much focus. If a fragment is ripe and ready, I need like 5, 10, 15 minutes and I can deal with some interruptions in there. And I can get, you know, I can get 500 words down. I can get 800 words down. And I can come back to it during the day. I don't have to be like, I've blocked off 3 hours. That's another thing. A lot of writers are like, I need at least 2 hours. If I don't have at least 2 hours, I'm not going to get anything done. A lot of times you don't need at least 2 hours. Like a lot of times if a fragment's ripe, you need like 20 minutes, 30 minutes, and then you're out, you know. I ran my own writing group where we did a silent hour of writing. And because people were so immersed in their stories and really working with the characters, about like 45 minutes into the hour, most people were done. You know, most people had put it down and were just kind of staring off into space or like, you know, maybe checking their phone because people had gotten out what they needed to get out. And that's surprising for a lot of people, especially if they have been putting off writing because they want the perfect space or they want, you know, 2 hours. I'm not seeing any other questions right now, so I'm going to keep going with the mess. So what happens when you're in the writing stage? things are really messy, you're really uncomfortable, the kitchen's being remodeled, you don't even want to go in there to make a sandwich. That's when a lot of resistance can come in. And resistance looks different for every writer. We all know like procrastination and perfectionism. Those are like the two big monsters that everybody knows. And most people deal with procrastination. That's a really obvious form of resistance. Like, I don't want to start, I'm scared that I'm going to fail, I'm just going to put it off. There are a lot of other forms of resistance. And just like it's going to be helpful to you to get to know your emotional cycles, your artistic cycles, how you do editing and what works for you, how you do writing and what works for you. It's going to be really helpful to observe yourself and see how resistance shows up. A lot of times, resistance shows up in the form of avoidance. And what that looks like is there always seems like there's something else you have to do. That's another, like, it's related to procrastination, but avoidance is, procrastination is like, oh, well, instead of writing, I'm going to clean the kitchen. But you really kind of know, like, oh, the kitchen doesn't really need to be cleaned. That could be put off. True avoidance brings in much darker stuff like martyrdom. That's my big thing. When you are using martyrdom to resist going into the creative process, it will look like, well, I don't have enough time, or my kids need too much of me, or my spouse doesn't understand and they're not giving me any writing time. You start projecting outward and you start blaming things in the outside world of like, well, I can't get this done, or I can't start writing because these things won't let me. Like, I would do it, but there are things standing in my way. Now, sometimes there are things standing in your way, but usually when there are things standing in your way, they're only in your way for a little bit. Like when my son's being crazy and interrupting me, every 5 minutes, it's super annoying. But that obstacle does generally fall away later in the day. Like he finds something to do, he toddles off and does it. My husband takes over. If you are really, really in resistance though, you're not going to take the opportunity once your kid has like toddled off and you're like, okay, now I can jump into that. You'll say, well, nope, now the whole day's ruined. Now I couldn't possibly do anything because my rhythm's been upset and no one understands me and I'm this writer and no one gets it. So it's really helpful to observe how you personally go into resistance. Like with me, it's martyrdom. I'm a victim of circumstances. With some people, it's stubbornness. Well, if I can't have it this way, then I'm not going to do it any other way. This is the best way to do it, and I know that, and I'm not going to do it any other way. Some people go into self-deprecation, this is a really common one for writers, where it's like, well, I always do things wrong. I'm going to mess it up anyway. Like, I already have failed. I tried to write the first scene. It didn't go well. And that's because I suck. And they go into self-deprecation. Some people actually use arrogance, and people are like, well, arrogance, what's that? Arrogance is when you isolate yourself from others and you refuse to ask for help. Because part of you say, well, I don't need help. I can do it all on my own. I can figure this out on my own, and that's usually, I'll read another writing guide. I'll do more research. But really it's not asking for help and support from others because you're afraid of being vulnerable. Arrogance is about fear of being vulnerable at the root of it. So if you find yourself thinking like, well, I can't ask for help or support, from anybody in getting more writing time in my life or getting good feedback on this manuscript, and I know I'm in the editing phase and I need that, but there's just no one good, it might be arrogance coming into play. And arrogance is the flip side of self-deprecation in the personality. So if you got self-deprecation stuff going on, you probably got arrogant stuff going on, and vice versa. Same thing with martyrdom is linked to impatience. People who are very impatient, they are the victim of time. There's never enough time. And this is something we see with writers too. I can't tell you how many clients come to me and they have a bag full of problems. They're like, I can't finish anything. I hate my creative life. I feel like a failed writer. And it's all because I don't have enough time. I don't have enough time in life. That's the problem. That is something that nearly everyone identifies, like time management. If I only had 3 hours every Saturday, if I only had my own home office. And that really is about impatience, because it's like, I really feel like time should be there should be a certain amount of time, sort of provided for me. And it should look this way. And if I can't have that, then I don't want any of it. It's like impatience with what is. It's a refusal to accept what is. So if you're listening to all this and you're like, well, that's great. Like, that's all very interesting, martyrdom and impatience and blah. But I don't even know where to start. Like, I don't even know, how I go into resistance. Start watching yourself live your life. Just day by day. You don't have to do anything about it. But when you're at the store, when you're in a meeting at work, when you're having a conversation with your partner or your child or a friend on the phone, just start watching yourself and observe how much you resist life and how much you accept life and let it in. So what this might look like, you've had a long day at work, you come home, you're super tired, you're cranky, you walk in the door and your kid's like, hey, I really want to go for a walk. Let's go for a walk right now down the block. Like, the moon's out, I want to see it. If you're in resistance, you're going to immediately resist that. And you're like, oh, I'm so tired. I just got home. I don't want to go for a walk. I don't care about the moon. I'm stressed. Like, this guy at work was such a jerk and I just want to have dinner and so you're resisting. You don't have to make yourself go for that walk. You don't have to push yourself to go look at the moon. Part of you is going to judge yourself. Like, I should have this moment in nature with my child, but just notice, okay, I'm really tired. I was already stressed and I'm in resistance. And how often am I in resistance in my life? How often do I say no to things? How often do I say no to people, situations? Now, sometimes saying no is healthy. Sometimes you really have looked at a situation or a person and you've said, yeah, this is violating my boundaries, or this is not good for me. I don't want to do it. I'm getting a no on it. That's fine. But a lot of times we say no on autopilot, and that's resistance. So when you just kind of say no right out the gate, you don't even hear what the person says, you're not even really listening to your kid. You're just like, no, I don't want to do that. Ask yourself what's going on and why are you resisting? Same thing when you pick up a distraction. When you check your phone, how often do you have your phone on you? How often are you looking at your phone? How often are you checking social media? How often are you on social media? How often are you reading the news when you don't really have to? You've already read the news today, How often are you kind of doing anything on autopilot because you're diverting, you're avoiding, you're resisting? And then when those situations come up, just observe. What triggered me to resist? How often am I in resistance? If you do this for a while and you're like, wow, I'm in resistance a lot. Actually, most of my life is lived in resistance. I'm just kind of clenched all the time and I didn't realize it. You're going to have more challenges in the writing stage of the intuitive writing process because you're going to bring that resistance into everything you do. And when things get messy or things get very uncertain, you're going to start to resist. It's going to feel safe to you. You're going to feel that you are keeping yourself safe because you're putting that wall up, but you're not letting things in. You're not letting in the fragments. You're not letting in the characters. You're not letting in the inspiration. You're not dancing with the creative energy. The creative energy is coming in and you're like, whoa. You're kind of big and you're spilling all over everything. And I don't know if I like it. And I want to get used to you first. I don't even know how I'll ever get used to you. You're putting conditions on it. Again, the goal is not to push yourself to change or shift, because if you notice, wow, I'm in resistance a lot, this might have something to do with my creative blocks. It's not going to be something that's going to change overnight. And you pushing yourself harder or beating yourself up for it is not going to be helpful either. It's going to be most helpful if you just observe and you let epiphanies come to you naturally from those observations. They will come. You will get insights and epiphanies, and they might not happen for days or even a month later, but you'll have these moments where you're like, oh, when this happens, that reminds me of my mom, and that's really hard for me, and I have a lot of emotional trauma around that, and I don't want to look at that. So every time that happens, I go into resistance. Every time I feel like things are out of control, things are messy, I can't trust life. I can't trust anyone around me. I can't trust other people. I can't trust the universe. That's what's going on. That piece is going to fall into place for you. It's going to start shifting on its own. You don't need to make it happen. Okay, so we have about 15 minutes left. Does anybody have any burning questions? And it's fine if you don't. I don't want you to pressure. I know last week I actually got quite a few emails from people who said, I had questions, but I was just too shy to post them. And I thought, wow, we were such a group of INFJs and INFPs. So it can be weird questions. Like, you guys can talk about anything. It can be vague questions too. So feel free, or you can email me tomorrow if you're like, no, this is too much, I'm too shy. So the last few things I will say is intuitive writing, it's going to be about a process of getting to know yourself. And what people almost always find, whether you're writing a fictional novel, whether you're writing a memoir, what you're doing is healing work. I quite a few sessions with you guys the past 2 weeks now, where you've told me about a character going through something. And you say, well, you either say the character's like too much like me and I don't like that, or I can't really like deepen the emotional connection with them. I can see them a little bit, but I can't get pieces of their story. There's some sort of block there. And then when I talk to you about the character, there's this barrier where you're like, well, they're going through some stuff and I know that, but I don't know that I really want to go into those dark places with them. And I always ask, like, do you have love for the character? Do you really, really love them as a person? Are you connected to them on a heart level? Because whatever that character's going through, it has something to do with you and your own story and your own healing work. If you really want to get on board with the rational writing methods, where you bang out a screenplay or a cozy mystery in 8 months and you follow this outline, you probably will be able to stay safe on kind of an island where you're like, I'm the writer, I'm writing from my armchair, I'm making these characters go through horrible things, it's not affecting me at all, ha ha ha, they're all made up, you know. If you are doing intuitive writing, it's not going to feel like that at all. The character is usually going to go through things that really, really are linked to things you have gone through in a deep way. The character is going to be doing healing work that mirrors your own healing work. This can get intense. This can get brutal at times. You will have nights where the character's keeping you up at night, where like you can't sleep because you had a really hard writing day. Same thing if you're going through, you know, if you're writing a memoir. A lot of people want to write a memoir and they want to just very dryly put down like, well, this event happened and then this event and then there's this theme that ties them together. Good, I'm done. But what happens when you're writing memoir, so much stuff starts surfacing that you didn't expect. So many pieces of your past and old baggage, old trauma, old debts. You know, when you hold someone in debt, it's the same as having credit card debt. You know, if you feel like someone's wronged you and you haven't really forgiven them, you're sort of like, no, you owe me, you know. That kind of stuff can come up when you're writing memoir. That kind of stuff can come up when you're writing fiction, like really gnarly stuff. And I know most of you saw in the Facebook group, I posted Mark Matusik's book, Writing to Awaken. That book is all about shadow work, because a lot of times when you're doing intuitive writing, you're going to be doing shadow work. You're going to be dealing with the psychological side of your personality that you don't want to look at. All the parts of yourself that you decided somewhere along the way were unacceptable. That doesn't mean they are unacceptable to other people. You know, it's just that somewhere along the way you decided you don't like that. That's unacceptable to others. And if you ever showed anybody that stuff about yourself, they would leave you, they would abandon you. It would be proven that you are unlovable, that you have, you're completely worthless. Like all of a human being's worst fears, that you will be outcasted from society and shunned and, you know, kicked out of your family tribe. Like all that stuff is tied to our shadow, and all that stuff is tied to intuitive writing. That stuff's going to come to the surface. Oh, Dale said, did I miss a book reference? Oh, Dale, in the Facebook group, I posted Mark Matusik is the author, and the name of the book is Writing to Awaken. And I do recommend people use that book for shadow work. It's a great book. You can find it in the Facebook group. Andrew G says, I remember my first home and a very innocent memory of sitting on the floor and watching a cartoon about a worm. It's just one of those memories that has floated in and out of my mind throughout my life, that memory. But I always thought about it in a first-person perspective. Thinking about it now from a third-person perspective, I see myself more as a character than a being I'm intricately emotionally attached to. I take it this is what you were talking about, observing the moment, seeing your situation from a detached perspective. Yes, and that's something that's going to happen too, is as you do this healing work, as you do this emotional work, you're going to move back and forth from really intense emotional stuff coming up, oh, this is gnarly, I hate it, to, oh, I've gotten to a place where I'm in neutral about it, and I can observe this with a detached viewpoint, and I can see, that happened, I think I can bring in compassion. You're going to switch back and forth. It's not going to be always like gnarly work, but yeah, it is going to kind of be like first person to third person, being the witness in your own life. Kendra says, how do I join the Facebook group? Kendra, I will I'll email you and I'll make sure you get in. We've been having a couple issues with people joining. Andrew G says, and that different perspective reveals details you may have lived, but can create and recreate in writing. Yes, and you know, stuff will come up that you never expected. I wrote a novel a few years ago, and one of the characters was a 15-year-old girl named Edward. And I was like, that is so weird. Why is this girl's name Edward? It was a name she'd given herself, but it came through loud and clear for me. And I was like, well, I guess this girl's name is Edward. Okay. And then a few years later, I was going through old pictures and I realized my mom used to have a dog when I was 2 years old, a female dog, and that dog's name was Edward. So weird, but like, yeah, that was in my brain and that surfaced, you know, and there was a link there. Like, that 15-year-old girl was dealing with a lot of the trauma and stuff that I dealt with when I was a very young child. So yeah, it's all linked. Let's see, Kendra says, can you tell when you read certain novels whether the writer is an intuitive? I feel like I can, honestly. That's a great question, Kendra. I really feel like I can. I definitely feel like Stephen King is an intuitive, for sure. That comes across so strongly to me. His characters, they're real. They are just so complex and full-bodied, and the details he includes, I really feel like he's an intuitive writer. I also feel like Dostoevsky is an intuitive writer. Tolstoy, I feel like, is an intuitive writer. Jack Kerouac is an intuitive writer. Ann Tyler, like I could just name them. And then I have other ones like John Grisham. I don't feel like he's an intuitive writer. Tom Clancy, definitely no. Dean Koontz, I gotta say no. Like the characters feel different to me. The characters feel much more like characters that you would see in a Hollywood script. You know, much more like, oh, this is the wounded but still honorable war veteran who has come back to his family after blah, 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 blah. And you're like, and Dwayne Johnson's going to play him in the movie. You know, so the characters feel different to me, for sure. Dave says, King talks about discovering his stories. It's like digging a fossil out of the earth, a story that already exists that he has to unearth. Yes, I've heard that too. And I think that is how it is for intuitive writers. He also has a story about little weird elves that come out at night and like go into the typewriter and type stories for him. And I can see that too. Because sometimes you're like, I don't know where this came from. It was just a gift from the gods. The creative gods just gifted me this story. Yeah, that's another good point though. When Kendra said, you know, can you tell if a writer's an intuitive? That can be helpful too. If you know you're an intuitive writer, and if you're in this group, you're an intuitive writer, start looking back at the writers who've really spoken to you, the ones that you felt a deep emotional connection with, that you've revisited a bunch of times in your life, and reread those books. And with the fresh eyes, you know, see like, what is it about this story or about these characters that's speaking to me so strongly? You know, how can I see that this writer really connected with the characters and really emotionally brought them through? Intuitive writing, it's about emotion. That's the thing. It's always going to be about emotion. If you lose your way in intuitive writing, you can always pick it back up again by finding the emotion, by putting your fingers on the emotional pulse. It's a very simple thing to do, and it's also a very easy thing to forget to do. But if you're like, I have no idea what the character wants to do, I have no idea where they want to go, I don't feel any connection with them at all, feel your way into them, just like you would in real life, like you do with real people. When someone comes to you and you're like, something's going on with them, I don't know what it is, but they're conflicted and they need to talk, and that INFJ, INFP ability comes out of like, okay, I'm going to hold space for this person. I'm going to do some healing work with them. You're feeling your way. You're watching their face. You're listening to their words. Where's the emotional charge in their words? You know, when are they looking away? When can they not make eye contact with you? What are they doing with their body language? All that kind of stuff. Edgar Allan Poe piece. Frank says the Edgar Allan Poe piece alone seems like an INFJ story. I actually don't know that piece, Frank. I know a lot of Edgar Allan Poe. I would say Edgar Allan Poe, definitely also an intuitive writer. I hesitate to say this because I hate like buying into stereotypes, but I do feel like intuitive writers throughout history, they are the ones who tend to have a lot of problems, like addiction problems, mental instability problems. A lot of writers who suffer from alcoholism are intuitive writers. I have like a really weird theory on this. I do believe that INFP and INFJ people are born with what I call a mystical temperament. And I talk a little bit about this in my book, The INFJ Revolution. But I really think that there's something in our DNA that predisposes us to be mystics and to connect with, you know, higher levels, other realms, spirit, the universe, God, whatever you want to call it. I think it's actually a genetic thing. I think it's a biological thing. And I think people who have this mystic gene also tend to really have challenges around alcohol and other substances. Alcohol and other substances, it like hits our system differently. And we either can't handle it at all, or we can become addicted to it really easily. But it just hits us funny, and like usually not in a good way. And I even would go out on a limb and say, I think Native American people are people who definitely have a mystical temperament overall. And you can see the problems with alcoholism there. I think a lot of times, if you have been cut off from your intuitive connection, alcohol or other drugs, it almost seems like a shortcut to get back to it. It seems like, oh, I can plug in and I can mess around with my consciousness by using this thing. And it doesn't work. It's like a total illusion. It's sort of like if you really, really want intimacy and then you go out and have a series of one night stands, it seems like you're connecting with people, but you're not. It's like a false illusion thing that's only putting you somewhere worse than when you began. Leanne says INFPs account for about a third of all suicides. I could see that. INFPs have a really hard time in the world. INTPs also have a really hard time. Both think so differently and navigate the world in such a very different way than the mainstream. So yeah, on that morbid note, we will probably wrap up for tonight. The good thing about INFJs and INFPs is that we tend to be really comfortable with things that are morbid or dark. So we've been talking about all of it tonight, especially the shadow. If any of you have any questions, like I know a lot of times, especially with INFPs, like the questions will come a little bit later, like maybe tomorrow you'll wake up and be like, oh, I can't believe I didn't ask this. Just email me, or please post it in the Facebook group, because I get the same questions from you guys and from my clients over and over again. And I think it's really helpful for people to see and get that validation of like, oh, that happens for me too, or I have that same experience. I'm not alone. I know so many INFPs and INFJs feel desperately lonely and misunderstood. So it really helps when you post questions. And I know also INFJs and INFPs live in fear that they are imposing and like, I don't want to be too pushy. I don't, just push away, please. That's what the group is for. That's what the Facebook group is for. Let's see. And Dale said, on a positive note, introverts in general guarantee the survival of the human race, per the book Quiet. Yes, we do. Thank you, Dale. We do. So I love all of you guys. Thank you so much for being part of this. I feel so blessed to work with each and every one of you and to get to know you all and to have you all in this class. It's been such a beautiful, beautiful journey. So yeah, I'll see you next week. And in the meantime, please email me and please post in the Facebook group. You guys have a great rest of the week and a great night.